Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. So you remember that the 911 dispatcher had made a call to a sergeant.
I was a sergeant in the 3rd Precinct on...
Have you had a chance to listen to a recording of that call you actually made?
Yes.
Hey, this is Jenna with Channel 1.
Hey, what's up?
Hey, I didn't know. You can call me a snitch if you want to, but we had the cameras up for, I don't know if they had used force or not. They got something out of the back of the squad, and all of them sat on this man. So I don't know if they needed you or not, but they haven't said anything to me yet.
Yeah, they haven't said anything unless it's just a takedown, which doesn't count, but
Okay.
I'll find out.
No problem. We don't get to ever see it, so when we see it, we're just like, well, that looks a little different. But
Sounds good, bye.
20.
So after this call, the sergeant called Drek to find out what was happening, and then he went to the scene himself just to see what was happening. By the time he got there, George had been taken away in an ambulance, and the sergeant, asked for the officers to take evidence from witnesses. Listen to what happened.
Do you hold any witnesses' names or anything while you're down here?
We can try. They're pretty, they're all pretty hostile.
Okay, whatever you can get.
Okay.
Do you hold any witnesses' names or anything while you're down here? You can find. Yeah, you can prove it. Yeah, I think I was.
The sergeant then proceeded to where George was. He wasn't really told much about what had happened. The prosecution asked the sergeant to confirm the police policies. There were various reporting and post-incident requirements that should have been met by Drek and his partners, but this never happened. Basically, because George Floyd was suspected to have had, drugs in his system, he should have been treated differently. Note what he says about seeking medical help. Because he was handcuffed, the sergeant should have been told.
Nerve pressure points, handcuffing, and gun drawing or pointing.
Also because he had suffered injuries. The sergeant was never telephoned. As you can see, it was the 911 dispatcher who had told the sergeant about the injuries. There were other ways to tackle this kind of situation. What should have happened was that George should have been put in a position on his chest, and then his legs should have been tied. His hands were already tied. That way he could not have been resisting arrest because he could not have been able to use his legs or his hands. But none of this happened. There is maximum restraint techniques, and this hobo restraint device is, like I said, where the person is put in a position where their legs are tied. There was no need for Drek to put his leg on George's body, especially because the police officers knew that George was high. I mean, even the cashier in the shop had said that George was on something. The police officers can be heard to be saying on video that George was high on something. There was no need to put him in the position where he couldn't breathe at all, let alone put a leg on his neck. There's still the debate about whether it was the drugs that killed him or it was the leg, of the officer that killed him. The problem is, based on the police policies as established in court, that knee should never have been on George. In fact, it was said in court that because George was on drugs, his body weight was enough to kill him. Imagine then having all the officers on him. Drek did not follow policy, and the sergeant only found out later that Drek had put his leg on George's neck.
Do you recall what the defendant told you?
So he said he knelt on Floyd or knelt on his neck, something of that nature.
And is that the first time you became aware that force had been applied to Mr. Floyd's neck?
Yes.
The evidence of the sergeant is very detrimental to the case of the defense. The policy says that a hobo restraint device should have been used to tie George down. So his hands were already handcuffed. His legs should have been tied. And then he should have been put on his side, to allow him to breathe easy. And that would have been the recovery position, especially when they found out that he wasn't breathing or moving anymore. There was no need to continue to put a knee on him. That was definitely not necessary. That was unreasonable force. Now, there was a very long sidebar. This is where the judge and the counsels talk, because the prosecution had asked a direct question, which was the kind of question that would be asked an expert. They asked the sergeant the question, which I'm going to play at the very end, and you will see what his response is. But the judge, after deliberation with the counsels, had allowed for that question to be asked. This sergeant is basically being treated as an expert when it comes to the use of force, and you will hear his answer.
Do you have an opinion as to when the restraint of Mr. Floyd should have ended in this encounter?
Yes.
What is it?
When Mr. Floyd was no longer offering up any resistance to the officers, they could have ended the restraint.
And that was after he was handcuffed and on the ground and no longer resistant.
Correct.